If there is one thing that beginner artists find difficult, it's drawing circles, ellipses, and cylinders in perspective. The main reason for this challenge is not knowing where the major and minor axis of the ellipse will be. I have to admit, it's a bit confusing at first, but in this lesson we will discuss the anatomy of ellipses so you don't get confused about it anymore. If we look at the ellipse in the front view with no perspective head on, we can see a full circle. The major and minor axes are simply the widest part of the circle on both axes. But in the front view, we can't see which is the widest part in any direction, since the width is the same on a circle. All we know that the two axes are always perpendicular on each other no matter the direction, and each part they divide from the ellipse should always be equal in any direction. Now, if you rotate the angle from the front view to the two-point perspective, things get a bit tricky. If we rotate the ellipse perfectly in perspective without any tilt, you will see that there is something wrong with this ellipse. If you apply the same vertical and horizontal minor and major axes here, it may divide the ellipse into 4 equal parts, but it will not look right. That's because the axes are not drawn with the same perspective, and they are not taking into consideration the convergence of the perspective lines. That's why we need to adjust the major and minor axes to fit the perspective angle. So first, we adjust the minor axis to end up at the other vanishing point, and also hit the widest part of the ellipse horizontally. Now we can add the major axis to be perpendicular to the minor axis, and also hit the widest part of the ellipse vertically. The major axis will always be between the largest distances of the two axes. If we hide the perspective lines, we will see an issue here. The two axes do not split the ellipse into 4 equal parts, and that's because the ellipse itself is vertical. It isn't tilting along the converging line of the perspective. Even though it's constructionally correct, it's not 100% correct in this perspective. Now observe what happens if we tilt the ellipse just a little. It still fits within the same rectangle lines, but now the major axis is hitting the widest part of the ellipse vertically, and the minor axis hits the widest part of the ellipse horizontally. Now if we hide the perspective lines, we can see how the ellipse is split into 4 equal parts perfectly. That's why ellipses should be tilted when drawn in perspective. Always remember that. Another tool you can use to make sure your tilt is correct is that the minor axis will always hit the perspective center of the ellipse as well. Now what is the perspective center? If we go back to the ellipse in the front view, if we can connect between the corners of the surrounding rectangle of the circle, we can see the center of the circle is in the middle. This is the perspective center. If we do the same for the perspective ellipse, we can see how the perspective center is not the same as the major and minor axis center. That's because the axis center is not the real center of the ellipse. The perspective center is, and it's converging along with the perspective lines. So even though that we see the 4 parts of the ellipse are not equal to us, they are equal in reality. The major and minor axis center is shifted to divide the ellipse into 4 equal parts as they look to the viewer, but they are not equal in reality as we see it here. This is due to what we said before, the converging lines of the perspective. The plane of the ellipse is smaller at the back and wider in the front as it moves toward the vanishing point. So the vertical top and bottom points of the ellipse will shift toward the vanishing point from both sides, tilting the ellipse slightly toward the vanishing point. As we can see here, the perspective shifting from the vertical axis into the tilted major axis line. So to recap, how do we know that our axes are correct? Here is the checklist. First, the minor axis has to hit both the center of the axis and the perspective center at the same time. It also has to go back toward the vanishing point and will always be perpendicular to the plane of the ellipse. Next, the major axis is always 90 degrees perpendicular on the minor axis as we said before. And the major and minor axis will hit the widest parts of the ellipse in both ways. The major is always on the longest distance of the ellipse and the minor is the other way. Finally, the axis will always divide the ellipse into 4 equal parts as they look to the viewer. If all of that applies and the ellipse edges touches all cross-section points of the rectangle surrounding it, then you are on the right path. If you always remember this checklist, you will always draw the major and minor axis correctly. Now let's draw the ellipse. There are 3 different ways to draw the ellipse in perspective, each with a different way to present the ellipse. And you can pick anyone to use yourself, and you will get almost the same results. Some will be more accurate than the others, and some will be easier than the others, but eventually you will get an ellipse at the end of each method. These methods are drawing the ellipse using a rectangle, using the major and minor axis, and finally using the transformation tool in Photoshop. The last one, of course, won't be an option if you draw using a pencil, but it can be replaced by using a multi-purpose ellipse template like this one. But we will go with the Photoshop tool here since we are drawing this in a digital medium. So let's start first with the rectangle method. Let's draw this in 1-point perspective just to make it easier at first. There are 3 positions the ellipse can take. Vertical, moving toward the vanishing point, horizontal or flat, laying on the ground, or vertical facing the viewer. So we start first with connecting the corners. In the middle we have the center of the rectangle and the center of the ellipse. Now we cross-section the rectangle in both ways, vertically and toward the vanishing point. Next we connect between the middle points of the cross-section. It will look like 4 smaller rectangles, with cross lines inside of them. To get even more accurate, we can divide these smaller rectangles into even smaller ones by dividing each smaller rectangle in both ways. Now let's divide the first part of the line from the corners into 3 equal thirds, and mark the first one near the cross point. We can do the same for the rest of the corners, or just connect this point to the vanishing point and get the other points from it. Now we have 4 dots for the vertical and horizontal cross-section, and 4 points for the first segment of the corner lines. These 8 points are the guideline points where the ellipse will hit all around. All we have to do now is connect between these points to get our ellipse. It's not going to be easy, so take your time to draw it correctly. Of course, you can rotate the canvas to help you draw better lines. And there is the ellipse inside the rectangle. Let's do the same process on the flat rectangle, connecting all the corners and then dividing the inside rectangles into smaller ones to finally get all 8 points we need to draw the ellipse on. Since this is directly in the center, I can cut half of the ellipse and mirror it to get the final ellipse. Here is the final position, which is 100% symmetrical on both ways, making it easier to draw. I divide the rectangle to obtain all my points. Now I connect the dots to create my ellipse. It takes several attempts, so I eventually draw one corner and mirror it vertically, then horizontally to get my ellipse. Here are all 3 ellipses in perspective. While these ellipses can be considered geometrically correct, they are not accurate in terms of perspective. As we discussed earlier, ellipses tilt in perspective toward the vanishing points. This tilt is more evident in the right ellipse compared to the left one or the center ellipse. Let's now add the major and minor axes and check if they are correct, as we know from the previous checklist. For the center and left ellipses, it won't matter as much since the tilt isn't as obvious in these positions. But as for the right ellipse, let's go down the list and see if it checks out. The minor axis goes through the center of the axis and the perspective center of the ellipse. The minor axis goes toward the other vanishing point. Both axes are perpendicular on each other. The edges of the ellipse hit all cross points of the rectangle. So far so good, but we have 2 issues. We can see that the major axis does not hit the widest part of the ellipse, and both axes do not divide the ellipse into 4 equal parts. So we have 2 problems here. To fix this, we need to tilt the ellipse so that the major axis hit the widest part of the ellipse and both axes divide the ellipse equally. With this slight tilt, we can see how the new ellipse still tick all the previous check marks along with the last 2 points. Now the major axis hit the widest part of the ellipse and both axes divide the ellipse in 4 equal parts. Be careful not to go overboard with the tilt. You do not want to get out of the surrounding rectangle or break any rules of the checklist. As long as all of them apply, you will be able to do it correctly. Let's see how we can draw these ellipses in 2-point perspective now. Here we have another 3 examples. 2 vertical ellipses pointing at different directions and one flat on the ground pointing toward the 2 vanishing points. We do the same thing we did in the last example. We start connecting the corners first, then we add the cross section in both ways, then connect in between the cross section point. Finally, we divide the corners into 3/3 and highlight the first third of the distance on all corners. All we have to do now is connect between all the points. You can use Photoshop Transform tool to help you out with the precision if you want, especially if you can't get the ellipse right from the first stroke. It will take a couple of tries, so take your time and be patient with it. And that's the first ellipse. Let's do the same for the other ones. Same steps for each one, connecting the points of the rectangle and finding out the 8 points of the ellipse to be on, and then we connect in between. And here are all 3 of them, side by side. Let's check the tilt of each one now by adding the minor and major axis for each ellipse. For the one on the right, the minor axis will be from the other vanishing point toward the center of the ellipse. The major axis will be perpendicular on the minor axis toward the widest part of the ellipse. Same for the ellipse on the left side. As for the flat ellipse, the minor axis here, as we mentioned before, will always be perpendicular on the plane of the ellipse, so it will be vertical in this case. The major axis will be perpendicular on the minor axis and divide the ellipse into 4 equal parts. Let's remove all the lines and check if that's the case for all 3 ellipses. It's a bit better than the one-point perspective, but we can see a few issues here. First of all, the line work isn't that good, but other than that, the division of the axes are not 100% equal to each other. So let's bring back the surrounding rectangle. We need to tilt the ellipses just a little bit so it can be divided equally on all sides. Now here comes the third easiest way to draw the ellipses in Photoshop. Now that we have all the background framework that goes into drawing the ellipses, we can simply tilt the ellipses by redrawing the ellipse tilting toward the vanishing point without going outside the rectangle. But here where the third method becomes handy. We can simply draw the ellipse on Photoshop by using the ellipse marquee tool, draw a uniform ellipse, and then free transform it to fit the surrounding rectangle of the ellipse. Once we match all 4 corners, we get the correct ellipse and the correct tilt and perspective. All we have to do now is right-click and select Stroke, and add the thickness of the ellipse you want. If we hide the previously sketched ellipse, we can see all 3 ellipses divided in quarters by the 2 axes we drew before. You can do the same if you are drawing it manually by using the ellipse tool. Again, I would recommend you to sketch it by hand first, before using any tools, like we did in the earlier examples. But as you move on, you can use this tool to make your life a bit easier. Especially if you are drawing a car or a big scene and you need to draw ellipses more accurately. Now let's see how we can draw the ellipse in different levels and perspective. To draw an ellipse, we still need a rectangle guide to contain it. If we need more than one ellipse, we can draw multiple rectangular guides. So here I'm drawing a big box, and within it, I will have the different ellipses in different height levels. So let's divide this box into different levels, drawing rectangles all the way to the top. Now I have different guides to draw the ellipses on. Here is how easy it will be to draw this in Photoshop. I can go through all the steps I showed you before to connect between the points and so on, or draw the minor and major axis, or I can use the ellipse marquee tool and transform it into the position of each level of this rectangle. This will make things much more faster, especially if you are drawing a complex object as we said before, with lots of ellipses in perspective. All you have to do is draw the ellipse, transform it into the surrounding rectangle, and finally add the stroke on top. And just like that, we have our ellipses in perspective in different levels. Also pay attention to how the ellipse is getting narrower and narrower as we get closer to the horizon line. Also we see the top of the ellipse under the horizon line and the bottom of it above the horizon line, just like we saw with the boxes before. If we connect the top and bottom ellipses, we will have our first cylinder in perspective. I can now hide the back end of the ellipse and turn them into form lines around the cylinder. A cylinder is basically the connection between two ellipses in perspective. We will draw more cylinders later on. But let's go back to the ellipse and see how we can draw a row of ellipses going all the way to the vanishing point. Very easy. All we have to do is draw a rectangle, connect between its corners, connect the center points to the vanishing point, and then connect the corner of the top bottom edge to the perspective line, going through the middle of the far edge, and then draw the adjacent rectangle next to it. Basically the same division method we used before on boxes. But this time we will fill these rectangles with ellipses using the marquee tool again. Use the tool to draw a uniformer ellipse, conform it to its own rectangle, and add a stroke on top. And just like that, we have a row of ellipses going toward the vanishing point. We can do the same method to draw flat ellipses on the ground using the same steps. Here is the same process but in one point perspective. We can mirror this all the way around and have a full room of ellipses going toward the vanishing point in the center. Alright, we've drawn enough ellipses. Let's focus now on the cylinder. Just like we converted a rectangle into an ellipse, a cylinder is basically converting a box into a cylinder. So to draw a quick cylinder, I'll start with a box. Now I have to convert the top and bottom planes into ellipses, and the connection between them will give me the cylinder I want. We can of course connect the dots of both planes as we did before and draw the ellipse manually step by step. Or just use the marquee tool as we said before for a quicker result. Once I do that, I connect between the two ellipses from the widest edges of the ellipse and get my cylinder. I lower the opacity of the back edge of the bottom ellipse since we won't be seeing much of it. And the cylinder is done. Here's an important point to notice. The minor axis for both ellipses on top and bottom will be perpendicular on the ellipse plane itself, as we learned before, but the connection between the two will be the major axis of the whole cylinder. The major axis for each ellipse will be perpendicular on the minor axis of each ellipse. It's a bit confusing at first, but I will explain. The cylinder will have one major axis that holds both ends together. That major axis will match the minor axis both ellipses share toward the vanishing point. To make this less confusing, let's call the major axis of the cylinder an axle instead of an axis. This axle is like connecting the axle between the two wheels of a car. In perspective, that axle will match the minor axis of each wheel, while the major axis of each wheel will be perpendicular on the minor axis. To understand it even more, let's see the cylinder in different positions and perspectives. Here we have 2-point perspective. Let's draw a box again and convert the top and bottom rectangle into ellipses like we did before. Now we can connect between the both ends and get the cylinder. Again, since the ellipses are flat on the ground plane, the minor axis will be perpendicular on both of them, giving us the axle of the cylinder in between, while the major axis of each ellipse will be perpendicular on the minor axis and connecting between the widest part of the ellipses, dividing it into 4 equal parts. Let's draw another cylinder, but both ends of the cylinder are not flat as we did before. They go toward the vanishing point. I draw the box first and convert both sides into ellipses and connect between them to get the cylinder. Now things are gonna get clearer here. The minor axis of each ellipse will go toward the vanishing point and hit both ellipses in the center. This whole line going through both ellipses will be the major axle of the form. While the major axis of each ellipse will be perpendicular on the minor axis and dividing the shape of the ellipse into 4 equal parts. Now let's take a closer look at the major axis here. Since the cylinder is going toward the vanishing point and not flat like before, the ellipses are tilted as they go back into perspective as we learned before. As they tilt, the major axis tilts with it as well. And the ellipsis is getting wider as we go back into the vanishing point, while the front ellipse is getting narrower as it gets closer to the other vanishing point. The tilt of the ellipse won't be the same all the way through the perspective. It will depend on the position of the ellipse in comparison to the viewer and the vanishing point. To drive this point home, let's exaggerate the cylinder even more. Here I draw the box even longer, going all the way into perspective. Now let's convert the rectangle on both ends into ellipses. The minor axis for both will be the same going all the way to the vanishing point. It will also be the axle of the cylinder itself. As for the major axis for each ellipse, it will be between the widest part of each ellipse, dividing the shape into 4 equal parts. Now it's even more clear how the major axis of each end is different, almost converging the more it goes toward the other vanishing point, and opening up as it goes toward the minor axis vanishing point. That is also due to the ellipse itself getting narrower and narrower as it moves toward the other vanishing point, and wider as it goes back toward the other point, or closer to the viewer. So keep that in mind. Both ends of the cylinder won't have the same tilt as long as the cylinder itself is moving in perspective. Let's now draw some real-world examples of the cylinders. Let's draw a wheel rim. A wheel rim is simply a cylinder with different shapes in the middle. So let's draw a box and then convert each end into the ellipse that we drew before and connect in between them. Now we can connect between the widest parts of each ellipse to get the major form of the cylinder. To get the center of the wheel, we can use the surrounding box to find the center of that wheel. Now I can draw the smaller rectangle inside to draw the hollow part of the rim. I convert the smaller rectangle into an ellipse as well and create even a smaller edge from it. I can now just freehand the design from the inner parts as long as I don't go over the ellipse limit. I can cut as much as I want from it by outlining another ellipse from the edge and make the inner cylinder go all the way in perspective. You can do as many different shapes as you want as long as you pay attention to your guidelines and perspective. To outline this shape now, I can use the pen to draw around the shape with correct and solid lines. The more you draw in perspective, the better you get. And the better you get, the more freehand drawing you can do in perspective. Now, for example, here I want to draw a ceiling light. I don't need to draw all the guidelines for it. All I need to draw is the main shape of the light as a cylinder, and then freehand the inner details. So let's say this is a hanging light from the ceiling. So let's draw a box and convert it into a cylinder, completely freehanding the whole thing. I keep everything light for now, since this is basically the design phase. I add smaller ellipses on top and bottom to shape the light while paying attention to the major guideline of the cylinder. All the lines I'm putting down conform to the major shape of the cylinder. Now I can add a few details here and there and some values. After cleaning up the lines, we end up with a ceiling light completely freehanded. The more you draw things in perspective using guides and perspective lines, the better you get, and the easier it will be to freehand objects in perspective, which is the point of this whole series, is to understand the guidelines so your freehand game will get better and better with drawing. Because you won't be going through all these guidelines while you are doing a large scene. It will be time consuming. So you need to understand the base first and then freehand your way to your whole perfectly drawn scene. And with that, we can stop the lesson here since it was long enough already, and continue drawing different shapes in perspective in the next lesson. This lesson was long and have lots of information in it. As with every lesson, I urge you not to just watch the lesson but apply it yourself as well. Drawing the ellipse in perspective is a very tricky subject, especially for a beginner. And it took me a while till I finally understood the whole major and minor axis and how ellipses sit in perspective. We will do much more exercises at the end of the perspective course to follow up on these lessons, so it won't just end here. But for now, we will move on to another important subject in the next lesson. In the next lesson, we will be exploring different basic shapes. So far, we studied the box and the cylinder. Now we need to explore other shapes that we can modify them later on. So we will quickly go over the basic shapes and then explore the concept of contour lines. Contour lines include center lines, diagonals, cross sections, and form lines. We talked about some of them already, but now we're going to apply them to all basic shapes, not just on the box. And with that, if you like this lesson, feel free to leave a like. If you have any question, leave it down in the comment section and I will do my best to answer it as soon as possible. To stay notified for future lessons, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next lesson.